Good afternoon, you all. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Thank you, Engineer Kaminder. Shall we start? I think by almost. My dear fellow engineers and ladies and gentlemen, I'm Lalit Pallegama, Chairman of Civil Engineering Section of ISL for this session. First of all, I would like to welcome you all, including our resource person, Engineer Dr. Vasantalal. Today we are going to discuss water resources and environmental problems that shape water policies in the US and lessons for Sri Lanka. Actually, we had several 2-3 lectures earlier very related to this subject, and we had a great opportunity to discuss with Dr. Vasantalal today, I think. So I'm not going to elaborate the topic because I must give maximum duration to our resource person. And our resource person, Dr. Vasantalal, has obtained his BSc Engineering from the University of Peradeniya in 1977 and Master of Engineering from AIT in Bangkok and PhD from Clarkson University in New York. After graduation, he was attached to CCP and worked on Mahavirali, Broadlands, and a number of other projects. He has also worked in Singapore and US on construction, revise, hydraulics, and hydrology. During the past 27 years, he worked in South Florida Water Management District, the government agency responsible for water management in South Florida, US, as a principal engineer and chief engineer. He was responsible for the development of computer model to simulate the hydrology of South Florida, capable of simulating integrated surface and groundwater system with 2,000 miles of canals and 780 hydraulic structures with pumps. He participated in many projects, including Everglades restoration projects and hydraulic analysis of seepage and wetlands. He has also participated in water resources project in Sri Lanka and computer modeling of Colombo with the Florida model. Actually, we are now in good positions to discuss these topics because we are having some projects and we are going to start some projects. So this knowledge is very important to shape up our projects. Before start, I would like to invite you all. I think all you will be muted by system, only host and co-host and presenter. But during the presentation, you can send some messages, and after the presentation, you can raise your hands. Then we can arrange to unmute your mics as the first come first serve basis. So I think it is time to invite Engineer Dr. Vasantalal. Over to you, sir, to your presentation.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, Doctor.
Okay. Good afternoon. First, I must thank the IESL for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation. IESL is probably the first professional membership I had in 1978. And this is a follow-up to many other presentations on this subject, water and environment. And I followed Dr. Manjri Tilaka, Sanjeeva, Kapila, Arupala contributing to this subject. So I think this is time to continue this conversation. It's a very useful conversation for Sri Lanka. And I have to thank Kapila and Sanjeeva for organizing this. And the goal of this is not to conflict or confront any earlier points of view, but to add to the body of knowledge. We all should go into a large project. And it's a little long conversation, but I'll be able to do it in about an hour. And it's a timeline story, and it is derived from experiences that I had working in a government agency. So my point of view is the point of view of a government agency, and I hope you will see some of the ideas that are carried forward in the US. So as an outline, I should say that sustainable systems existed for thousands of years with many civilizations. I just want to point out that this is nothing new, except we have different ways of doing it. Industrialization, competition for resources, lack of respect for Mother Earth, change a whole lot of this stuff. and there were consequences in the 1960s and 70s as a result of these changes that took place after this industrial expansion of sorts. Sorry about this noise close to the road. And reawakening of the West. So in the West, a lot of these lessons were learned pretty fast, and they were rethinking about what has to happen. And towards the end, what ended up happening was these decisions on whatever the things that were learned, and ended up being policies that was implemented following those years. And the lesson to learn is that you learn from these mistakes, and you find better ways to do this. So just one slide to go back to the pre-industrial industrial period. The ancient civilization of Sri Lanka had so many systems to have agriculture, human living, and there were so many pieces of it. And in a similar way, in the in the American continent, the ancient Indians, called Aztecs and Mayans, and those cultures have their own systems of agriculture. Here's an example on your right, where people used floating grass to create agricultural systems that would carry them for the year, and that's because all they had was marshes and lakes, and there was no land for cultivation. So civilizations were very extremely capable of creating systems that would take them through. Now, let me first talk about the build and control era, the way I call it, and most people call the same thing. If you look at how it started primarily because of or with canal construction to take goods from a place to the other. And the best example is the Hamilton Canal in Sri Lanka. And in US, you have the Erie Canal in New York, and you have the Tennessee River, you have Mississippi. All these rivers were used for transport of commodities. And it happened so much so to a point that they had to create control over construction. There was so much of construction, and even the Kissimmee River that we had discussed sometime by I think Sanjeeva, was a result of canal expansion and modifications that people never thought had consequences. So it all started with growth into commerce through commodity transport. But then early on, through the expansion to the West, the US had what you call the Reclamation Act of 1902, and the creation of the Bureau of Reclamation. And the idea of the Bureau of Reclamation is to provide support for irrigation projects in the West. So here's a picture of the Western expansion and a farmer creating cultivation in the West. So this was the early 19th century. And what changed some of this stuff, and some of the side tracks of this, was the World War I and the post-World War I glory that created people to a situation where people started investing in big money, and the stock market went up, and suddenly the stock market crashed in 1929, ending up in a recession that created so many poor people who decided to migrate to the West and start farming. So that was the second disastrous consequence of some of the economic ups and downs of the states. So the entire set of group of people who migrated, the poor people, actually created farming practices and started farming without understanding what the environmental consequences were, and that created the first wave of problems in the US after the settlements. So here's an example of that those consequences, and I use these translations in a way that explain the idea, but not exactly a literal translation. So this is a pretty bad time for the Midwestern states, Colorado, Kansas, Texas, and New Mexico in the 1930s, because of the farming that was done through mechanized agriculture, mechanized plowing, and no concern for the soil. There were these huge dust clouds that the dust and deposited in other areas, and you see here all these cars and houses were were under threat from these big sand dunes. And that was a lesson that was learned way back in the 1930s. It's a famous event where people realized that soil conservation is a big, important part of agriculture. And that was the reason why they founded the US Soil Conservation Service, which is a big government agency, just to focus attention onto these projects. Now, here comes a kind of a basic idea of what the American West looks like. Now, American West is pretty dry. And here is the green areas is wet. So half of the country is practically dry. And you compare with the Sri Lankan rainfalls per year. Now, even the lowest rainfalls in Sri Lanka, like 1,000 millimeters, is somewhere in the green range. So practically, Sri Lanka is in the US wet zone entirely. So for us to claim that these are dry zones, it's not technically true from a US point of view. Just wanted to bring up the awareness of where we stand in terms of the US West. So after the Dust Bowl and the Depression and the attempt to do a calculation, one of the big projects started by the President Roosevelt was the Colorado River project, where the entire Colorado River, covering an area the size of about 10, 20 times of Sri Lanka, was dammed, blocked. There were many reservoir projects were started, and one of the famous ones was the Hoover Dam. It was the 1920s and 30s, and Davis Dam, and I think about 20 dams in the whole system, practically stored the entire annual supply of runoff in the system, coming up to about 4 times the annual rainfall is stored in these systems, and diversion of some of these waters into the big cities, and here's for the California's water needs, and to the Arizona and different places. So you have these diversions taking water all the way far into the west to support these large cities. So this is one of the biggest projects that US has seen in the earlier 20th century. There were great benefits out of this project. It was initiated in 1922 after a compact between 6 states. It's a massive project that actually comes from the snowmelt in the Rocky Mountains. And the benefits are huge. It was able to irrigate about 2 to 7 million acres of land, 4,000 megawatts of power. This is not exactly the power era, this is earlier times, and provided flood control and supported 20 to 40 million over the years. There were so many large dams, the Glen Canyon holding back about 4 times annual river flow, and it benefited so many states. So this is, at the time, is a very beneficial project, took over the entire landscape in that area. And the downsides of this project. Now, this is a learning period. So one of the biggest complaints was overuse and over-apportionment of water. So everybody's fighting for the water to the point that they had to renegotiate the treaties between the states, and they were renegotiating over time and complaining that somebody else is cheating. And at the end of the day, they actually went to the Supreme Court to resolve it. And they still continue to fight now with different circumstances. For example, the climate change is one of them. And the environmental issues to the south, to Mexico, because the river practically dried out and they try to kind of revive it. And then salinity is a huge issue, loss of species, no fish, and so forth. And now actually the biggest difference is the climate change and the decreasing of snowmelt, creating shortages of water for everybody. So you have to renegotiate the renegotiated agreements, and it's a new reality. But there were many things that were studied and understood, and lessons learned out of that project. And one of the biggest things was how do you manage water? How do you, come into water compacts? How do you create apportionments, and who's given priority, and how do you create? The idea finally came down to like what's called the beneficial use of water. If you're creating a beneficial use, you're given a priority, but then there are so many beneficial uses. How do you prioritize them? So there were so many issues that were discussed, sliced and diced to the end until they are still working on some of these issues. And the excessive use is still an issue. And when the supplies are short, they have to relearn how to save the water and not to use some of these precious water supplies. So there's so much of work is going on, understanding how to manage water itself. So, and then there were practical consequences, or the sociological. People learned that, building large dams is not exactly such a good idea. You have to think really hard, So that was an idea. And here's an example of a compact. So these are just an example. So it says okay, from February to November, find the discharges, and if it is less than 100, divert somewhere else, beside this or the other. So there are so many rules built into the system to make sure that everybody is taking a fair share. Now, the Colorado project also created so much benefits to the rest of the world. It's hard to believe. And one of them is actually the creation of the labs that was supporting the technology behind the dam building. And the USBR, the US Bureau of Reclamation lab in Fort Collins, Colorado, is one of these labs. So that created these measuring devices, and here what's called the partial flume, and there were so many other flumes. And the other part was that this research also created these great formulas, equations, and the idea of stilling basins, and they really understood that without these pieces, you just cannot manage water. So you cannot not just manage water, you cannot store water, you cannot control it, and you cannot manage it. So these are some of the lessons actually, the ancestors in Sri Lanka probably learned a long time ago, but they had to relearn it in a more systematic or scientific way with larger labs in these systems. So that was a contribution. We still benefit from these manuals. I remember in CECB working for the Mahavirali early years, this was one of the Bibles which described how to create the sluice gates, stilling bays, and that was the early stages of the Mahavirali project. So there were so many documents that were created explaining the purpose, the function, the formulas, and so forth. So there were so many benefits coming out of this Colorado River River project. So even though you can complain the pluses and minuses, the scientific community benefited tremendously out of these projects. So, and then came the allocate but conserve. This is primarily the learning process that was created by the Colorado project. People were more focusing on, okay, what's wrong with conserving some of these resources. So President Roosevelt himself created this conservation idea. And here I'm pointing out an example in Florida. This is the state of Florida, and then these are 3 big areas of land, actually practically wetlands early on, that he created. He used to create what we call water conservation areas, which mean that nobody can go there, and the water that's collected in these areas are for the natural systems sustenance, and not to be used overused. And it turned out that all the demand from the East Coast cities really benefited from these water conservation areas. If not, they would have run out of water and would have created a huge problem. So it was a very timely idea to conserve these spaces, and including the Everglades National Park, which was under different treaty passing through the Congress, but they were all conserved as protected areas. And the idea of natural, what you call natural resource conservation, was big in 1930s after learning from the mistakes. So the idea was to protect the water, the forest, and the soil. Here's a comparison of the conservation projects in the US versus some of the conservation ideas in Sri Lanka. Now, if you look at the scale, now all these 3 Ns and 3 As, 3 Bs, these are all conservation areas aligned from that earlier conservation process. Now, in Sri Lanka, in the same scale, this is actually 1 kilometer. So these small areas are practically tiny, 1 or 2 kilometers wide. So in comparison, the US has a huge allocation of conserved areas compared with the Sri Lankan projects, Sri Lankan conservation efforts. So that was just a comparison. I try to explain the US projects and then sidetrack briefly to Sri Lankan projects just for comparison. So after the conservation era, what came was the idea that multiple objective use is a proper thing to do. So this is not still understanding all the basic ideas of water use, but to think that you cannot just do a project for one thing and one thing only. And it was Professor Arthur Maas in 1960s in the Howard University who actually fought for the multi-objective use of water resources, and he practically said that you cannot drown the poor people because there's an Army Corps project. So that was practically the idea. And for that, he was actually called a communist. And there were hearings in the Senate called by somebody called McCarthy, one of the senators. So fighting for the allocation of water or protection of the poor people itself was something at the time that would take you for Congress, the hearings from by the Congress. So he actually contributed for multipurpose analysis of resources. And to the multipurpose end, we have hydropower added in 1920s. He has an Edison company creating a generator to be used first in the Niagara and then to cities like Chicago. So these projects added the third dimension to these large water projects. And I'm trying to come back into Sri Lankan setup. We were fortunate enough also in Sri Lanka at the time, 1920s, 40s, to create this Castlereagh Mausakale system, was one of the most appropriate systems at the time. And we benefited. I remember in Kadawata, we got electricity in 1960s before the O-levels. So there was a tremendous amount of benefit coming out of these projects, even in Sri Lanka. There were complaints, and one of them was, okay, the waterfall is drying out, but then there were ways to mitigate that. One of the examples in Niagara Falls was that you cannot reduce the flow below 100,000 CFS. So even in Broadlands now, I heard that there are conditions like the minimum flow to make sure that the benefits are not totally taken off from somebody else. And Mr. Vimala Surendra was one of the pioneers and who's actually a national hero on this project. So there are benefits out of these projects in the earlier times. So hydropower and irrigation became a multi-purpose projects in part of the multiple projects in earlier times. And TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, was one of the government agencies that was established in 1933 just for that purpose. So at that time, with the idea of multi-purpose projects that was to come, they were trying to work on providing flood control, hydropower, agriculture, navigation, and all at the same time. And just like as I said before, the effort was to make sure that the transportation by these big barges or the ships gets smoother through better river transportation. So the idea was to regulate the river, control the floods, and make it easier for the river transportation to take place. Now the TVA was special for a variety of reasons, and people say at the time that actually even the Mahavirali project was following the TVA ideas. Now, if you look at the TVA project itself, there's a massive amount of storage. These are mountains, pretty less populated areas of Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, poor people. So the livelihoods of these people had to be brought up. That was an idea in the 30s. And the idea was to store the water in the reservoirs and regulate it. And it practically looks like this is a step form of rivers. So as a result of this project, you could practically navigate with these ships upstream to some of the higher points. So the Tennessee Valley project has some other benefits beyond the Colorado River projects, and primarily navigability, which is not useful these days, but actually did flood control. But the primary driver was the hydropower and agriculture. People don't realize the agricultural contributions from the TVA project. So there were 29 dams providing 20,000 megawatts of power. And one thing that we don't see in a big way is the introduction of better farming practices. So people were plowing these lands in a in random directions, and nobody knew that contour line furrows are better than the other furrows. So it was erosion of soil, unlike in the Dust Bowl, which is due to wind. Now this turned out to be due to the rainstorms and water. So the soil was eroded. So there was a huge 180-degree turn around in these areas by creating the educational campaigns and programs to teach the farmers how to take care of their soils. And it turned out that TVA indirectly benefited US in a big way. For example, the airplanes that were needed for the World War II were created with the hydropower that brought aluminum into the picture, and all the airplanes that fought in World War II actually were created with this production of aluminum in the TVA area. And the Manhattan Project is also close by. It probably benefited from this. So TVA has indirect benefits in winning the World War II also. I don't think they planned for it, but it actually happened. Not too many complaints on this project because the benefits of TVA was so overwhelmingly significant that one thing they complained was the private companies are complaining the TVA power is too cheap and they cannot compete. So that's not a complaint, that's something good. And the people say, okay, you use excessive authority and so forth. But essentially TVA is still functioning and with a different focus. In comparison, I thought it's interesting to bring back the Mahavirali into this picture. So Mahavirali is also a multi-purpose project for irrigation and hydropower and settlement. And both governments worked hard to bring it up. It was funded by very favorable loans. It was a useful project, and it created so many opportunities for people to go settle down in areas that were considered to be dry zone, but actually not exactly dry zone. But it was through government efforts, Mahavirali Authority, CECB, that created that opportunity for many farmers. And I'm not going to describe these projects, but the essential idea was that you create these hydropower and reservoir system up in the higher mountains, and you divert most of that stored water to work for the off-season agriculture and to provide water supplies to other areas. And one thing you also notice is that, in comparison, there are reservoirs here, but there are a lot of reservoirs here too. So, in a very strange way, you created reservoirs here when you also have so many reservoirs here. So the challenge is to actually how to use all these reservoirs in connection and not just to rely on some reservoirs in the high rainfall zone. So there are challenges and benefits. So the benefits, 470 megawatts of hydropower, it's pretty big at the time. Many 250,000 acres of irrigated land in the dry zone. Flood control is big, even though it's not in our areas in the south and west. There were new settlements, and there were minus consequences too. For example, the focus on the headworks was so high. The settled areas are the areas that actually had any issue, if any. So some of them I copied from some different reports. One was unequal income distribution. The other one was the settlers kind of are trapped in areas where they don't have much of a control of their own economy, and the reliance of outside water. So people get the idea that the water has to come from outside, as opposed to realizing that there's water in your own system too. And poor control of your own situation. So people had to, understand that people realize that the water comes from somewhere else, and the amount of control they themselves have does not seem to be there. I'm not going to go into details because I'm not too familiar. I'll let you know what's in the literature. So there's also complaint that the marketing sense, farmers don't make the money, and somebody else, the third party people, make the money, and have nothing to do with the project itself. But the areas are suffering from various issues that have nothing to do with Mahavirali project itself, but the areas aren't really getting all the pieces. So, for example, in the TVA, the agricultural practices were improved in a big way, and in Mahavirali areas, I don't think the local agricultural practices practically improved that much when compared to the TVA in US. So that's something I noticed. And it's also stated in the Mahavirali reports also. If you read the 2020 Mahavirali report, it says the projects such as watershed restoration, management, dam safety, and infrastructure improvement projects actually have negative impacts and threatens animal species. So there's work to be improved, and that was clear from Mahavirali reports themselves. Now, on the US side, the big growth area or growth period kind of came to an end towards the 1970s. So there were three examples of what created those issues is here. For example, one of the rivers is called the Cuyahoga Waterway close to Ohio River, caught fire so many times in 1960s, 1969. So here's an example of that fire, because there were so many industrial plants that had the effluent coming into the river that was toxic and flammable. It caught fire. And the example was nothing to do with water resources, but these big companies dump chemicals and then close with soil, sell the land to somebody who doesn't know anything, and then move away and pretend nothing happened. So people got cancer. So there's a huge issue in the 1970s. And one of the other issues was some of the insecticides, and nothing to do with water resources, but DDT and other chemicals were creating certain bird populations disappear. So that was one of those other things. So all these effects created what we call an environmental era in my point of view. And one of the pioneering persons who was leading that effort was, I shouldn't say she was leading the effort, but she was the one who triggered so many of those conversations. And it was Rachel Carson in 1962 created this book called The Silent Spring. And what she was explaining in a very eloquent way is that all the birds are gone. It was quiet. It was spring, and realized what happened to the birds. So that conversation created so much of backlash from this pesticide industry, and she was called a traitor, and she was called foul. And what was going on in the background was that the bird population, especially the bald eagle, have nothing to eat, and all the insects are gone because of DDT. So that brought up a big movement towards understanding of the environment. And here we have our own share of activism. And here's a picture that is worth 1,000 words. So moving on, the background for that entire effort was the idea that you just cannot, take out one insect and expect the entire system to survive. And if the insects are killed using chemicals, the birds cannot survive, and then the fruit trees cannot pollinate. So this is a system that you have to sustain for your own survival. And that was slowly understood, and people got that through their skins. And the biological function is there only if the entire system is there. It's not something that you can play with. And here's the thing called food web. So you have to have all these pieces in that system to have it function for the betterment of humanity. And the word biodiversity came through that effort. And here's an example of the amount of bees that are shipped from the East Coast to the West Coast for the pollination of the fruit trees in California. They have these containers, keys to pollinate the flowers in the Western states in agricultural areas. So people understand that this is not some simple thing. It's a pretty serious thing. And the reaction was pretty swift. And the Republican senators and congressmen in the Nixon era, 1970s, they created this. They were pushing for this thing. We need to do something, and that was what was called the Clean Water Act. It was a major milestone in U.S. History. And what they initially wanted to do was to identify the water bodies that are polluted, recognize that they are polluted, and make sure that they are eliminated at some point in time. It was 1985 or any other time. There is a understanding that you need to protect the fish and the wildlife, and you have to create wastewater systems. You cannot just dump your sewers into rivers. So that was very clearly understood. And you should be able to bathe in a river. That was the kind of the colloquial way of putting it. So with that goal, and also with the understanding that nobody is above it, like it doesn't matter. It was Amazon, Exxon. You just have to follow the Clean Water Act. It was a primary driver in growth into new areas. It's an act that is to be executed by a primary government agency called the Environmental Protection Agency that was created along with the act. And they did an amazing amount of work along with it. Now, I know this through reading and I know through this practice, but we have people actually from Sri Lanka working in these agencies too. So some of the things that this agency created, one is called the creation of the drinking water standards. So they, through statistics, through risk analysis, created the drinking water standards for many parts of the world. They also created what you call a discharge permit system, we call MPDES, to limit discharge of pollutants. And what they meant by that is that if you discharge pollutants into the climate, into the system, you better have it within a certain standard so that the entire system would not collapse. So that was a fundamental idea that carries forward to this date. So they created the discharge permits, now actually issued not exactly by the federal agency, but by local agencies, but that really helped. And also it had a research arm. It was a regulatory agency also at the same time, but it has other effects. And the other major change for people like us who do engineering is to realize that that this is not a joke, and the environmental engineering, the ecosystem itself is an engineering problem. You cannot run away from it. You don't have to be an environmentalist, but you have to be practical to realize that you cannot ignore it. And every engineering solution actually have to include the in that solution, so it becomes practically useful. And something we can also learn from gens is that all the agencies, they used to work for all kinds of reasons. It can be reclamation, it can be anything. Army Corps of Engineers, they have a common goal, and it was a water policy that was clearly written down, and there is no multiple purposes. The purpose is very clear. It was the protection of the water resources and the ecosystem that supported, which I'm going to go slowly. So the idea that everybody has to work together towards one goal was a pretty serious benefit out of that Clean Water Act. And then came the details of it, and one part is called the policy making for the benefit of the economy and the environment, protection of the environment. So I'm going to explain some of the ideas about policy, because we have policies, but we need to make sure that these things actually work. So these are some of the ideas that were carried forward in making policy. It has to be committed to a specific level of performance. So you cannot have just a statement saying you need to improve something. You have to tell exactly improve what, and improve to what extent, and how much. And it should be something that you can measure by an independent person. So it's going to be pretty clear what it is that you improve. So it has to be measurable, and it has to come up with a strategy, your policy. And the policy should say that we're going to improve, and this is how we're going to do this. And those are actually, at the end of the day, they are in manuals and books and public education campaigns and so forth. And there is a need for an organizational structure to carry out that thing. So it's pretty seriously taken. So the lessons learned in the environmental era was pretty stubborn and strict, and it was a way to make sure that these mistakes are not going to be repeated again. And the last one is actually called implementation program. So there are so many programs that were created just to make sure that the level of pollution is not going to be sustained, and it actually goes down within a known period of time. One of the second primary ideas was the idea that there has to be local control of these resources. You cannot just do it from Washington, D.C. or some of these places. It has to be delegated to regional organizations. And here's an example of that thing. And it says these water management bodies, which are, it can be based in a river basin setting or multiple river basins or regions, but it has to do the following functions. The following functions are all in one organization. You have to do flood control, you have to do water supply, irrigation, drinking, so forth. You have to do water quality, you have to maintain certain standards, and also you have to protect the ecosystem. Now, why would you put it all in one agency? That's because they are so connected. For example, if you want to have a water supply, you have to make sure that the water that you save from flood control is available for the water supply. So you cannot do one without the other in two different agencies. If you do, what happens is there won't be any water left. After the flood control, people actually get the water out of the system. So that's one example. The other example is the ecosystem protection. You cannot do ecosystem protection without control of the water. So you have to have ecosystem protection also added onto the water supply part of it. So all these four components actually go in one, and also the idea that water cannot be protected without the environment, and the environment cannot be protected without the water was very clear, and we call it a watershed. So those were ideas that evolved since 1970s to a point, and in 1990s, it was very clear among all the agencies that water cannot be protected without protecting the watershed itself, and the watershed cannot be protected without having the water in it, and also the idea that you need these watersheds to sustain life and yourself. So you're not talking about somebody else, you're talking about yourself and your own livelihood. So if you go into the EPA website now, and there's a thing called Healthy Watersheds Program, and all this jargon about the geomorphology, riparian corridors, and biota habitats that we thought they're not for us, that's for somebody else. They are part of this entire system of understanding and system of components of the ecosystem that need to be protected. So there's a thing called Healthy Watershed Program. There are so many programs and manuals and so forth, and including the fragmentation of the habitat and all that stuff. So they're all part of the same project, same focal idea, and that's what I need to say. Now when you look at, like, okay, what's the basis for these arguments in a legal sense and also in an engineering sense? So here are two basic arguments that I'm going to put to you. So one is called the idea of public protection. This is like protection as a service to the public. So it's very clear that you have to serve the public in this fashion, and how you serve is by what you call the risk management. So one idea is called the level of service. What it does is that it provides a certain protection of the population from the risk of flooding. So you can evaluate various amounts of risk that these communities are exposed, and you can manage the risk by doing projects and etc. The second idea was what we call savings clause. That's new to people from here. You go there, never heard of that one. But there's a legal argument that says that an agency cannot make situation worse by doing a project. So it says it directs an agency that is there to protect the public from adverse changes from a project and conditions. So you just cannot make things worse for anybody as a result of a project. So that came out of this idea of the policies being driven for the protection of the environment or the protection of the people. So that is the primary driver. You're not doing a project for nothing. You're doing it for these benefits. It's very clear. And here's an explanation by the Department of Interior. It's a government agency. Also, I want to bring an example of the use of this. So here's an example where you're talking about a highway bridge. So there's a number of things you need to do. It has to protect the people in the area from flood risk created by the bridge. So for example, we use this thing called the 100-year flood risk. So it's in 1 in 100 year flooding is the only. So you're at a risk from any higher, severe than, more frequent than that, but you're protected from any flood smaller than that. And the other one is called the protection of the the road itself. So people use a lesser level of protection. So we call 25-year flood risk protection for the roads. And you also have a savings clause. You make sure that the road is, the bridge is not going to create any bad effect on the hydrologic system, the power, the water supply, and livelihood. So you cannot get people to go into bankruptcy just because of your project. And the other one is actually you have to make sure that the watershed itself, which supports life, is protected from these projects and whatever you do. Whether it's in the public sector. With the private sector, actually, there are other mechanisms, but for the public sector, which engages in large projects. So the conditions before and after have to be the same, and it cannot be worse. So that's the idea. So here's, I'm not sure what's the cause of this flooding, but whatever the cause is, here's the hospital in Gampa, and it's being flooded. So I would say that's an example of the violation of the savings clause. So any project that makes things worse than what it was is something that you need to take control of and be aware of. So now let me go into a little different type of detail. So these agencies that were created as a result of the Clean Water Act, so they have four main functions in the goals, and one is and taxes, fines, and education. So I'm going to give an example of a permit. So there's a thing called flood runoff control permits. So any new land that you use for construction or a project cannot release more than a certain amount of water. You need to retain it within your property to make sure that that runoff, number one, would not environmentally damage somebody else's property, and number two, would not create flooding downstream. So there are permit levels, permit standards that could prevent release of water into the rivers. Taxes is something that is common. So to maintain these agencies, you need to have taxes and fines if you violate the permits, for example. Education is a really important component where you have so many manuals open to the public and so many design manuals, permitting manuals, and something really interesting is what you call the BMPs, the Best Management Practices manuals, that tell you how to do things to be compliant with a permit. So there's no exact one way to do this. So there may be certain choices, and you may like a flower garden to do this, and somebody else might like a ditch and so forth. But there are so many ways of achieving. So it's not strictly one way to do this. So I'm going back to now explaining who's controlling these things. So the attempt is to make sure that these organizations are not politically driven, even though there's a fair amount of local politics too. So there's a 9-member board appointed for a 4-year term, cannot be fired, but they are staggered, meaning you can only appoint 2 members. So one governor appoints 2 members, the other governor appoints 2 members. So you don't have overloaded with your own people. And the people who come into this thing have to live in that area and then have to be upstanding citizens with some experience. So, but they cannot violate the basic tenets of the Clean Water Act and what follows with that. And really quick example of how you support it, the amount of taxes that you charge, it's called a millage. They have the authority to tax, and they call it like 0.23 to 0.4 per 1,000 units of property value. So if it's a bigger land, you pay more taxes. So for example, if you have a 10 million rupee property, you probably pay about 3,500 rupees per year. Now, I'm not saying this example have to be copied somewhere else, but just the idea. And also make sure that it doesn't really increase crazily, and you cannot increase more than 20%. And a few things real quick. Government agencies are not just on their own to do their own business. There's a huge effort to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. So I just want to bring it up because there's so much to learn out of these things. So for example, if somebody works in a government agency and decided to retire, you cannot work as a consultant for the same agency for 1 year and you have to do something else. And that's one example of making sure that there's no conflict of interest. And the retirement packages, the salaries are practically at the same levels as the private sector to make sure that people don't leave the government sector and just go join private sector. So one example. the projects are reviewed very openly. So all the agencies, multiple agencies, because they have a common cause, common policy, it's not too hard to have groups of people reviewing the same document because and to have a review policy that is open is a tremendous advantage, because you take those reviews pretty seriously. You have to make sure that people accept the projects. And furthermore, one of the good ideas is that the policy goals are written pretty clearly, and the strategies are also pretty clear. So you personally don't have a conflict of interest because you understand why it is for. So you are practically for the idea, and you yourself believe in it, and you don't have somebody else to believe to work in an agency that you don't believe in. So the idea that these policies are clear and very openly designed is a good thing. So it makes it much easier for people to work in these agencies. So, and in general, they are mostly expected to pay for themselves. So it's kind of isolated. So you don't really get money from one area of the project and pay for some other project. And to realize that the projects are not exactly for the return of investment. Projects are done for a broad variety of reasons, for public good, public safety, public risk management, and so forth. So the projects actually have a reason, and in the same way, the EIA that we do, I just want to bring it up here, even though we don't call it EIA. I mean, we call it EIA, but it doesn't really explicitly show up as EIA. The impact assessments in US are practically integrated into the study. So it almost becomes, it looks like the study itself is an EIA. So if you take the example of a model study, the models are so huge and hefty because there are so many environmental constraints built into these models. So if the model actually it has probably, let's say, 20,000 lines of code, 2/3 of those lines are environmental clauses that you're not supposed to be violating. So whether you comply while running the model or after the model run, compliance with the environment is the project, and it's not a afterthought from the project. And if needed, we always have the choice to hire independent consultants. So it's not saying that this is all a government project. So let me, even though it's outside of the policy discussion, there's a need to talk about models in a quick way. That's because this is probably the only way how it's affecting the system. So you cannot just, on the sky, make decisions and assume that these things are going to be implemented. So models are used to understand the effects of what you do. Now, I'm just comparing the evolution of the models themselves. So earlier models were called water balance models. So we get the inflows, we get the outflows, and we get the reservoir capacities and the controls and decisions, and then you simulate the system, and then we are happy with the project. So that was how it was done in 1960s. Now, over time, people understand that all these other things like the groundwater, the wetlands, and precipitation and the soil conditions, you need to take care of that too. So people started using these things called physical process-based models. So in Florida, I think since 1970 or maybe 80s, late 70s, people were gradually building up physically based models. For example, it's not exactly a lump that you consider when you look at one of these systems. Now, in the case of a lake, it's easy. But you look at all the pieces of the environment, it's the infiltration, the groundwater flow, the water table, and surface runoff, and all that stuff, at least most of it, in a very practical way, are considered in these physically based models. So these are the models that are used to evaluate projects and their benefits. Now I want to show an example of a result that came out of these models, just so that you understand. So here's the two figures, one on the left showing the natural system of South Florida, where all these are arrows showing the pre-drainage Everglades and the South Florida system, where the water went and where it started and where it ended up. So as a result of the human settlements, we see the entire flow patterns changed and the amount of water going down south is reduced. So to understand these systems, actually, you need these complicated models. So I I used one of these models just because I was the one that created these methods. I applied it into Colombo just to see what it looks like. So here's the Parliament Lake, and here's the Kimberley road here. And you can see after a rainstorm, so there are these little surface streams that would come in and join the Parliament Lake. This is one of the large inflow streams into the system. So the idea is to show that it can be done. And I was also hoping that, okay, this is an ideal place for a cascade system. I was just thinking. And I want to give now, having talked about the policies, given examples of policy implementation, real quick, flood risk management. What do you do with this idea? So the basic idea is to make sure that the public is protected. Pretty clear from the onset. So there are management approaches based on the level control and the discharge control. They're both conducted, and one approach that people use most of the time is called the structural approach, which means that you create a structure that would do what you want done. This includes levees, dams, and etc. So the idea was that through these structures, you control either the discharge rates or the stages. Here's a second example of managing a runoff system. So it's a basin level discharge control permit. So it's called a permit because you go into these small zones. So this is a map from earlier times, because now they use computers. You don't really go into this level. So here's an area that has number 42 in it. So what it tells you is that in this area, you cannot release more than 42 cubic feet per second per square mile into the river. You're permitted up to 42 and not more. So what it does is that anyone who's doing anything here have to create its own little, either a drainage disc or reservoir or detention pond to make sure that that water doesn't go in. As a result, the overall system is somehow under control and won't get flooding. So that's what we call I call it the shared responsibility. So everybody is given a limit, and you follow the limit as best as you can because of the permit settings. And I thought I wanted to bring in one example. It may or may not apply, but I thought after reading this paper by Sohan Vijayasekar, I thought I need to at least bring the idea. So this is the Nilvarha River, and then I'm looking at it, and it says it has abandoned, poor drainage, soil subsidence, acidity, all these areas and these things. I thought okay, if you had some of the environmental permits that used to have in Sri Lanka, would have solved some of them. I'm not saying the whole thing. Like, for example, retaining the first inch of runoff, that would have created, that would have prevented the fertilizer runoff into this area. So that's one. Other one is actually the farmers make sure that you don't release more than per square mile. Here's an example. You don't release more than 100 CFS per square mile. So if you have a 2 square mile area, you can only release 200 at the peak, not the total volume. So the whole idea is that you try to control runoff and control pollution running down the catchment. Each and every person take a share of that effort, rather than letting one government program take care of it. So that's the part. I'm not saying you don't need a government program. You probably need one in addition to that. But this is also a way that the farmers realize that they have a contribution. Now, here's a serious example of that actually happening. Now, this is the South Florida area that I was talking about, with a lake here, a big agricultural community, and the canals taking down water through the conservation areas. I hope you can see my cursor. And what happens is that these farming areas release a huge amount of nutrients, phosphorus, fertilizer into these systems, to a point that all these conservation areas actually started to get change its ecosystem qualities. So different types of plants and the whole thing goes crazy. So what they had was to introduce this thing called stormwater treatment areas. So these are stormwater treatment areas, and what it does is that it takes in these fertilizer laden runoff and treats it and release as better quality water into these conservation areas. And also there's a national park, Everglades and the Big Cypress. So idea of stormwater treatment area, stormwater treatment itself is a pollution control approach used in in Florida. In a very tiny way, the same idea, the control of pollution and runoff is also done. Every individual household has to have a small size pond that would retain at least a half an inch or 1 inch of runoff out of its entire property, the piece of land he owns. And these are required for all houses. And you see any new house, you see a rain pond, a rain garden, and that's a good idea. And it's continuing its effort to control the pollution, runoff, and the flooding. Here's a different idea that is used to make sure that the risks are balanced. So, for example, the 100-year floods are the houses are protected by 100-year floods. So if you build one, you create up to that level. You may have to dig a hole to hit the soil, but at least you make sure that that hole is available for the compensation of the flood retention volume that was taken out. So the roads are protected to a lower standards and so forth. So these are all permit conditions that would keep these systems going without too much headaches. And here's a little more detailed version of that retention pond design. So the idea I just wanted to give you, so there are components of it. So one component is to make sure that there's a dead pool, just so that the fish won't totally die. And then there's a thing called water quality volume, which is the area provided for the first inch of runoff that has most of the pollution in a rainfall setting, a rainfall scenario. So you calculate the amount of water that's needed for a 1 inch or half an inch of runoff. You create that one, and then you also make sure that your total runoff is not exceeding the permitted amount. So you do that by a volume here that would absorb the inflow and ensure that the runoff is not going to exceed that big number or whatever the permit number that you have. And you make sure that this crest is set in a way that you're not getting flooded yourself, your own property. And then the structure is capable of handling the runoff that is required by the permit. So by doing this design, now here can be a large site for a factory or something like that. And here's another example, the same example, but I thought it kind of came from Maryland. But the interesting thing about it, they even specify the trees that are needed to be planted. And what you see here is that there's a whole variety of plants, including a small wetland and a small pond here and a little deeper pond, and the trees are specified. I'm not saying you need these same trees, but the idea is so fantastic that you try to create an ecosystem itself within your property that would carry the responsibility of complying with a permit, which is an environmental permit that makes sure that you don't put effluents onto the streets or the canals. So these are permits that would keep the systems clean. So this reminds me of the systems actually. Mostly both of these gentlemen, Dharma Sen and Madhu Bernard, talks about, called the small reservoir systems back in the history people used. So these are called village tanks that were there in Sri Lanka for thousands of years. And you can see the filter beds, the filter strips with trees. You can see the sediment control areas, and you can see outflow control. And you also have the village and your farm in here. So this is probably practically the best design you can ever think of, which is something that in US people have been going and moving towards over time. And that is exactly the people had in Sri Lanka for thousands of years in a sustainable way. And extending this idea, here's a shopping mall in Birmingham, Alabama. You practically recreate a little ecosystem with frogs and bass and everything else. So all the runoff from these parking areas would end up in this thing, and at least keep it clean because of the vegetation. If not for the vegetation, this would be a smelly pond that nobody would like to come close to. Now here's a different example of the use of these approaches for flood control and protecting the human. So we have a thing called so once a local government actually has flood management system, they introduce a thing called the Federal Emergency Management Administration and an insurance system. So depending on how risky your land is, you probably have to buy flood insurance to make sure that in case you get underwater, that you're compensated for the damages that are created. So it's a kind of a good idea too, especially in Sri Lanka, where you practically get drowned over repeatedly. And just to go beyond that slightly, there are other methods too. And one is called these non-structural methods, meaning you don't build any structure, but you provide flood control through other means. And one example is what you call avoid creating the problem. And so if you think that whatever project you're doing is going to create flooding, do it. And that's one non-structural way of doing it. The other one is called keep most of the water in your source, and keep the runoff inside. And flood proofing is another idea. Learning to live with floods is also another idea. Now here's an example from one of the diagrams the water management district created. So it tells you, like, okay, when it floods, just learn how to live with it. You may survive because the flood levels may not be bad, but your backyard may be underwater. So there's nothing wrong with having a backyard full of water for a few days. And the second component, which is the first component, is saving the people. The second component is protecting the environment. So three examples I just want to give. One is called minimum flows and levels. I think people use it here in Sri Lanka too. People have minimum flows and levels just to make sure that the environment is not destroyed as a result of anything that you do. The other one is called the performance measure. This is a big component of it. So once you create a model scenario run, you make sure that the performance indices that you have created for the performance of the environment are not going bad. So you make sure that your water depths and your flow and the discharge and the timing and the duration, they're not altered as a result of this. The third example is called a habitat suitability index. It's not quite often used, but you have an index that would make these animals happy. So some animals are happy with 6 inches of water, some animals with 2 inches of water. So depending on that, you create an index and you map that index. So here's an example of one of those maps that you create after a model run. I just want to show that how much effort is done. The last part of that effort of water management is to guarantee that there is enough water for the people to drink. And this is an example of a report that you are required to provide by the federal government, by the central government. So all these local agencies have to provide this thing, showing and demonstrating how you're going to provide water for the people in the area for the next maybe 10 years, 5, depending on all these things. So it gives confidence to people that there is some assurance that the people in the area are going to be sufficiently provided with the water supply and drinking water and so forth. So here's an example of a report I found in the internet. That's for the Broward County. This is a neighboring area that they have ways of showing how water is going to be provided. Here's one of the areas, one of the other examples of use of permits, groundwater permits. Actually, this was reminded me by a colleague of mine in the US. He said, like, okay, what about the groundwater well permits? The water supply for the is in the Florida area and most of US is provided by these wells, groundwater wells. So you have to monitor them, because if you take too much water out of it, the salt water intrudes and it gets red. So these are the indicators to show which wells are functioning, which are not. So they can be public water wells and private water wells. These are like big wells, bulk runoff wells. So there's a cap for how much you can use, and there's a cap on the duration and when you can cut back, and when the droughts are there, how much you have to bring it down to. So how you use the well is under permit, and these are constantly being monitored and modeled, and people keep touch of it. So I just want to show the one of the well maps. So these are red. Red is because they've already been damaged because of salt water, because it's so close to the ocean. But then you have this little pond that is being fed by water from the conservation area. So as a result, there's a constant inflow of water from these ponds into these wells. So the wells are green because these wells are happy and they provide a good water for the system. And then some of the wells are being damaged because of either sea level rise and various other impacts. So groundwater permits is also one of these areas. So the last topic or the subtopic is restoration era, and we call it restoration because you realize that you have come too far, you have to go backwards. So here's an example, one from the Indian River Lagoon, which is a close by area. Thousands of fish died, and on the map in the state of Florida, this is one of these coastal areas. So in these coastal lagoons, thousands of fish died, and that's because of a thing called the brown algae. It's an aquatic weed that killed the fish. And there's another one that is actually there right now. It's called the green algae. So you are not supposed to swim in it or get into the water because they're supposed to be toxic. It's in Fort Myakka in Florida. So I got this photograph in 2016. So there are things that have to be reversed to make sure that you go back into a place where you can live. And one of the pioneers on that direction is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She was a lady who lived until 1998. She actually was one who wrote a book and argued about the U.S. government, the Army Corps of Engineers, was destroying the Everglades, which is a wetland that is next to that is right in the southern end of Florida. I said the fragile ecosystems are being damaged by these government agencies, and they are doing for the benefit of agriculture and real estate developers. So she fought for it, and then she really won a battle to a great extent. As shown in this diagram, you have a map of the natural system where the Everglades is being made wet through the water from the lake. And when people settled and created the levees and structures and everything, it got dried out, and only this small tiny part is left. So the idea of restoration is at least to bring back some of that wetland space and create a little bigger area for humans, and also hopefully to take out these levees and canals and to the extent possible, and create a new system that is much more environmentally sustainable and much closer to the natural system, even though it's not really close, but it's the best you can get. And the restoration era also brought ideas. And here's one other idea that is being running all over. And that idea is that you can actually use the polluted urban water and send it to a wetland, we call it treatment wetland, and store it for use in the future. So you can actually use groundwater wells to consume it. So the idea that wetland is not just a natural system, but you can use it as a filter is a very prominent idea, and is practically being used, as I said, to treat this agricultural runoff. This is a pretty big area with probably 150 miles. And then these small stormwater treatment areas are used, they are treatment wetlands, and they are used to treat this agricultural runoff and feed the clearer, cleaner water into these conservation areas so people in the East Coast can consume it. Just the image of this mixture of things, and here you see all these houses are packed, but still they are compliant under all the permit rules. So there's little wetlands. They may not be perfect wetlands, but as good as it gets. They throw all the storm water in these little ponds, runoff. So there's a runoff cleanup, and then at the end of the day, the runoff is being fed into some canal somewhere, and as a result, there's flood control as provided by the agency permits. So these are probably the last two slides, and the key lessons in US is that some of the lessons learned from these experiences, the entire the pre-environmental era damage, was that you probably needed to create some public policy for the sustenance of the human areas, and as well as the environment itself, and you actually need the environment for the humans to survive too. And the other is that projects are carried out primarily based on policy and not just handpick the things that you wanted. And public policies not really benefit the local public. That's the word here. And also to make sure that the full participation is a necessary part of it. And there is also a good idea called fund sharing from the public. And in the case of US, taxation is one of these ways of sharing the funding. And the projects in general supposed to pay for itself. So here's the last slide, and my suggestion is for the engineers in general to have a common understanding of how projects should be implemented, and to have a national policy idea which will tell that you need to protect the local people, you need to protect their livelihoods, you need to protect the water and the environment whenever you do a project. This is especially applicable to Sri Lanka. You cannot violate some of the basic ideas as to why you do projects. You do projects for the people and to make sure that the environment is protected so that the people themselves are supported in those areas. And the second idea I'm thinking is, in a short-term basis, to create independent review panels in IESL that would have a combination of professionals from various disciplines and come together in a very professional setting without any conflict of interest to discuss and review projects and grade them. Actually, AAC had one of these ideas too, to grade the entire national project setting. So I would conclude with those ideas, and I believe I can make the presentation available to anybody who wants it through IESL, and I would probably entertain questions at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Vasantha. We can see several questions in the chat box. Do I need to read it out? Or,
let me see where the chat box is.
anyway, I can read it out for yourself.
Right, I can see the.
Shall I read it out?
Can I see some of the questions. First question I see is, what is the approach of the Conservative Republican Party to have compliance with the Clean Water Act and the control of pollution? Now, these are questions that I can answer to the best of my ability. But I think it was funny that during the Nixon era, they knew that there was a problem and there was no way of running out of it. So they were the ones who initiated a solution for that through the establishment of the Clean Water Act, of the EPA and the Clean Water Act. But later you find out that various administrations are trying to dilute it. The best example was during the last years, the Clean Air Act. It's not exactly the Clean Water Act, but the Clean Water Act, the EPA was also affected to some extent by the appointment of people that some people thought were not appropriate for this time. And so you can make your own appointments and put the wrong people because the chief or the top positions are filled by the federal government, and even though they had to be confirmed by the Senate, but you can have your own way if somebody decided to do that. So are you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So Kapila Pires is asking, I think now with these kind of presentations, the ultimate connection between ecosystems and water is clear. Or with the Newtonian scenario, how now it's high time to go beyond the paradigm and to get real understanding of these things. So I believe that we engineers are the last to because some of us in the earlier times we were not exactly familiar with what the ecosystem is, but over time, once you understand and realize that these are key parts of your own space for life, you have no choice but to take these things seriously. So the proposed national water policy is somewhat compatible with what you explained. I hope so. And I have seen the water policy in I believe 1980s, and I have seen some parts of what it is now. But here's what I propose. I think it's a much more comprehensive approach. You probably have to have people from a variety of disciplines participating in it, and it has to be totally disconnected from any single interest whatsoever. It cannot be purely environmental people. It cannot be purely irrigation people. It cannot be hydropower. It has to be all of the above. And to realize that who is this for? And I remember the very first time it's done, people thought that was an idea where you can actually sell the water. So before the rumors go around, I think somebody should bring really good ideas to the front, and with that, people would feel protected. I think in US, all these acts are for the people to be protected. So if you ask somebody like, how do you know that you are protected? Is it because of an individual? No, not really. Yeah, okay. Individuals can also protect you to some extent, but the policies and the laws are the ones that would keep you protected. So I would say, a group effort is a good thing, and I think it's a good idea to go forward. In terms of career development, I'm talking Darshani into. So in terms of career development, environmental engineering is still a viable area, and there's a conflict also. Like, environment is a kind of more like a science topic, but it's engineering. So it's a combination of these topics. So there's a thing called environmental science, where you understand the system. Then there's a thing called environmental engineering, where you take advantage of that science to do things for the betterment of the community or betterment of the environment. So environmental. Now by the time I was graduating in 1977, we didn't have any. So all these things are things that you learn if you need to survive, or if you need to do better for the society. So I would say the opportunities are there. I'm not exactly sure what you can do in US. So the proposed flood mitigation strategy for this from Samani China River consists of flood embankments up to Hangwell, with over 55 pumping stations, together with upstream reservoirs and downstream part of Callan River. That is to be protected. Is the natural flood pan of the river and the unprotected area. 2016 flood repeated, spread it up to Gotatu, and the recession took nearly 6 to 7 days, shows the need for of the extent of the flood plan needed for the flood volume generations in Callan catchment to discharge. Parliament sub-catchment is somewhat isolated from riverine floods and readily protected. What's your opinion about the effectiveness of this strategy? I would say that any project should, number one, be comprehensive and make sure that number one, people are involved in it, people who are living in the area. Number two, their livelihoods are not made worse through the entire study period, not just the flood itself, but after the flood, before the flood, during the flood, and so forth. And I would also suggest that consider the cost and who's going to support it. So if you talk about sustainability, from what I understand, like with 30 pumping, I'm not exactly sure that this setup is something that the local people can support themselves. So it becomes a project where the government would have to pay for the 30 pumping stations to function. So things like that would put things into little doubt in terms of sustainability and the cost effectiveness. So I'm not exactly sure of the details, but I would hope that any project or any idea that you come across should be from the people's point of view, benefiting them and not costing them with what you already have. And then they should be part of the conversation. And also should involve not just the flood studies, it should involve the entire year-round studies. So in US, we carry out studies of the entire systems for 30, 40 years now. Actually, we've been doing 30 years a couple of years ago. Now we do 40 years. You study through the dry seasons, you study through the wet seasons and high storm volumes and low volumes and who's affected, and create flood zones so people are aware what's the before project flooding situation, what's the after project flooding situation. Then you realize, okay, there's a benefit to it. So without doing some of the detailed studies, it's a risky thing to dive in and just look at some flood scenarios in a few years and decide a major project. That's to the extent I know about this thing. So we have to restore the traditional tank village systems to ensure the balance between the water management. And I totally agree. Actually, and I mean, something that we don't see the value of our own things until you go outside and see the same thing. I say, wait a minute, this is something I already have seen. So it's to me, you know, I see the full circle of things, and I'm not joking here. I'm actually seeing things from the US point of view, and in US, what I said was something that is taken for granted, and say anything else is something that people will be shocked. So I would agree that these systems have to build in these functions and not just the massive, large-scale projects. What's your opinion about dredging ancient tanks and making sure that make them more efficient? I would say that times that you may have to dredge to make sure that there's some space. One example is to make sure that the fish won't die during dry season. So you kind of make it a little deeper in a certain pocket. But as long as it for specific environmental function, I would say things that need to do, because there's heavy siltation in some of these ponds because of poor soil management practices. So now you correct some of these mistakes. Not that you have dredging a continuously done thing, but until somehow we protect the soil from erosion and creating these vegetation strips, you may have to correct some of the mistakes. And if dredging is part of it, I would say, yeah, do it in a careful way, but not as the solution that would solve all the problems. And then, according to local water level control of water resources policy adopted by the US, how do you recognize our Yoda Aleph system established by our forefathers? I hope such one will fall well within the policy adopted by in the US as well, but still not be able to recognize the value of our own, instead still follow that the West is following. So it's funny that when you say the West is following, now I just explained what the West is following. We don't have exactly the old Yoda, but we have so many tiny ponds. I think you go to one of the GIS maps or the GPS, the satellite maps, and see how many ponds are there. I calculated approximately 12% of the plan area of South Florida is ponds. 12%, and in Sri Lanka actually it's like 0.1%, such a small tiny amount. So we have not had enough reservoir capacity. And as a system of canals, I would believe that the Yoda system was created so that if there's a water shortage in one of these ponds, the neighboring ponds can provide for the water. So even though it's a canal, it also works as a two-way system of getting water in and out of it. I believe there is such a system in Florida. You don't see it just like people don't label it as water as a Yoda, but there's a huge, massive network of canals and ponds that would eventually feed into the flood control drainage system, but they are all interconnected through small canals, and the entire area is because of the high rainfalls. It's a network of canals that we don't realize, and actually is by design. So I would believe that the Yodala system is live and well, except we don't seem to see and value the groundwater part of it. I think one of the big changes is that we don't see groundwater as a big thing, whereas in US people learn from the West that the groundwater is so important because we have it, and here we have it and we don't take it. We kind of take it for granted. So I hope people actually start seeing these things more into the future. And
excuse me, Dr. Asante, one engineer wanted to ask some question before going to the next question. Shall we give a chance to him?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Engineer Gauri.
Hi, Vasantala. This is Mahendra Ratnam,
Hey.
your batchmate.
Yeah.
How are you? Yes, I just, first of all, thank you for the very useful presentation. It was well presented. So I have a question, not necessarily for you, but I was just thinking about it. Do we have proper policies and regulatory framework in Sri Lanka? And if so, what is preventing implementation of those policies? And if there is an issue with implementation, what do you think? What's your opinion on how an engineer or our engineering society can contribute to improve those implementations? If I make myself clear.
No, it was very clear, Mahendra. I think I had to tell that you are one of the volunteers to help in this thing. But I'll tell you the way I see it. It's you have the EPA. The CEA, which is the environmental body. But I think there's nothing wrong with the CEA. But I think people don't see the value of the CEA and support it. People kind of use it as a rubber stamp, the way I understand it. And also, it's not funded and staffed and an agency that has huge momentum and to carry forward new ideas and to evolve and to change and to adapt and so forth. So it's a kind of a standard engineering, standard government agency that would kind of do a day-to-day stuff. So I think people don't see the value and the need, and as a result, they kind of let it just sit there and not evolve, and without enthusiasm, without people supporting it by the government or by somebody else. I think I would hope that it will be more powerful than what it is now, with a broader group of professionals, engineers, and not just scientists, and variety of other professionals come together and create good ideas for the country. I hope somebody else can explain this too, because my understanding is pretty limited. I don't, I practically don't live here. So anybody wanted to answer? I have no issue with that.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, Vasantalal. Now, like you, I don't have a proper understanding, what is there now. But is the professional society, our engineering society, has something to do or contribute to that, or we don't do that?
I hope
I'm not asking you. Anybody.
I know. Yeah, I hope the IESL would take up on that. That's one of my proposals. So, if you cannot wait for somebody to do these things. That's how in the US too. You have to do it yourself. So I would hope that they up and go with it. So that's my hope.
Yeah, I just want to let you know that there's a lot of interest, not only within Sri Lanka but outside, to contribute to this kind of initiatives. And what is lacking is an organization, to create something to bring all this knowledge and effort together. And I thought, as an engineering society, I don't know the magnitude and the abilities of the society, but if it is in US, those societies have much involvement and engagement into policy making. I don't know whether in Sri Lanka it's possible or not, but if the engineering societies cannot do it, it is hard for an individual to make these initiatives. So I think that the society should take a lead, but I don't know the limitations. Thank you.
So Anura Rangola actually has a question. He said, what's the idea about flood bonds, dikes? What's the current global practice and constructing flood bonds or separating the threats? Now here's, now this is actually the reason I wanted this presentation. So there's nothing called like, flood bonds are good or flood bonds are bad. You have to have your project objectives. So very clearly the project objectives are, number one, to protect the people, and number two, to make sure that there is protection for the environment and protection for the livelihoods of the people. So with those goals, if flood bond is what does it, I think in the way that we try to live in an environment next to it, we may have to have a bond to make sure that we are not affecting the environment and the environment is not affecting the people. So if there are no people, you don't have these issues, but because people are in the middle of this environment and for their own survival, you need these environmental systems, and also make sure that you are not flooded. Then we have already distorted these systems. So to protect ourselves, if flood bonds is what it does, there's nothing wrong with it, as long as you have a reason that follows a policy of environmental sustainability and reduction of flood risk. So with those goals, I think you could have it. A dike itself made of soil isn't exactly something that is bad, but at the same time, if you have a nice system, you put a dike in the middle of that, doesn't seem like a good idea if you're not doing for a reason. Even though in the history it was done because people wanted to settle it. Now people are learning how to settle, but also not to ruin the environment. So I think you still use dikes, but you can be a little more smart about using dikes, or maybe using some alternative ways of both protecting the people and the environment. Like one way is to actually make sure that the water runs off through a wetland to somewhere else and not affecting people. So I think that's probably how you should look at it. Yeah, when you say, luxury, does Sri Lanka have a proper policy? I think if you look at the laws in the actually irrigation department has books and books of many laws. I think what did not happen was the equivalent of Clean Water Act in US. In Clean Water Act, it was very clear that things are messed up and you have to come together for a common goal. Now that part didn't happen in Sri Lanka because we were not hurt by these. I mean, we were hurt by it, but nobody came together to create a common goal and to create a common goal that would protect the humans and the environment. So that's a missing part of it. It's not that we don't have laws. We have laws, but I think the laws are as disconnected as the laws in US in 1940s and 30s and 50s. They were not focusing towards a common goal. So number two. So I'm reading Nissan Garli. If I suggest that the priority number one is to safeguard the ecosystem and the environment, number two, to safeguard all the animals, number three, implementation of the project. What is your comment on it? I think they all kind of come together. Like, for example, if you say protecting the people, you need to protect the people, but the people would not survive without the environment. So you need to protect that too, along at the same time. So this is a kind of a simultaneous effort. So we keep our own environment for our own survival, because if we survive and the environment doesn't exist, we're not going to survive any longer either. So I think that was generally the idea. So I think I see the prioritization has an effect, but I think the overarching goal is something that is a combination of all these things. So to see some of the engineers in Lanka cannot understand and comply with. So Dhanuka, here's what I'm saying. Actually, I didn't really say. Here's something I learned. I did not say anything new. All I said was what the ideas in our own work environment. So when we go to work with people in US, these are common things that we talk. There's nothing extraordinary about any of this stuff, but when you live there, you really understand the value of all these things. So I think these are things that I see that probably during the time of King Parakambahu, they already knew all this stuff, except we don't know that now. So all that examples and lessons we learned from our ancestors are all forgotten, and we haven't really learned the new things either. So to say that development is something that involves creating levees or creating reservoirs and so forth, it has to be taught in a very comprehensive way, just the way probably our ancestors were thinking about these things as systems, as ecosystems. And it's hard to believe that I myself am preaching this after graduating from Peradene with no environmental background. All we did was structures from Dr. Ranavira and then Tureraja's soil mechanics. We didn't learn any environment, but then over time we have to learn these things when we understand how systems fail. And the job of the engineer is to make sure that these systems would work for the population. So we have a public duty to bring this up and do the best for the population and also the environment, because the population depends on. So very. I'm going through the questions. Right. I think it's this is the reason I was saying that whose responsibility is it? I think it's a combination of these groups. It's not exactly, we cannot wait until the solution. At the same time, wait till something like that. I would say AAC is a good thing, and here's an example. Here's the reason why I'm saying this. So, US, the same thing. Previous government, the Society of Civil Engineers, was requesting some renewals of bridge projects and various other projects, and nobody wanted to do anything. And then what happened was the AAC came together and created a system where they started giving grades to various projects. So the AAC gave the grade D or C for the civil infrastructure. So independent of the government, the engineering organizations were saying you are not funding the public projects. So recently I heard through the Biden administration, there's money to do these projects. So there are ways of putting on the government to organizations. Concrete question about construction of dams with concrete in Sri Lanka under the Mahavirali development project, but the time for the concrete is deforming and all that stuff, which is not well everybody. Right. I think it's a mixed message. Here's what I'm saying. You don't see large dams being constructed in the US. There are two reasons for that. Number one is actually most of the large dams are already being built. There's not so much of large dam space left. And there are some surviving large dams. I don't think these dams are going to go away real quickly because they are providing support for multiple states. And California wouldn't survive without the Colorado River. So I don't see these things going away, but I can see people learning to live with without the support of the dams. Example is being careful with water, conserving the water resources, and various practices of agriculture that doesn't require so much of water from the system. So there are various ways of avoiding the thing. I don't see the big, large dams will be there in US, but I would see people adapting to live without it. Maybe multiple small dams, earth dams may be possible, and then doing better with your own rainfall resources and creating dams in your own properties and like permits, as I was explaining. So, but unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, there's another factor, which is that there are so many river basins that don't have any storage capacity left. And one example is the Nilwala Basin. There's not a single reservoir. And I'm looking at Gampa. The Gampa doesn't have a single big reservoir either. So if the Kalina River runs out, we are in trouble. So there is a need for storing water for the growing population. I'm not sure it has to be large dams. It has some storage capacity. So the idea of storing water for the and floods is not an old idea. It's still a valid idea. The difference is making a structure is going to be sustainable. I would say it has to be sustainable. If you can avoid the reinforced concrete and everything else, I think it's a good idea. Everybody would agree because of the lifespan itself, and lifespan at the most is 200 years. People wanted solutions that would stay longer than that. Here they say the EIA is a prerequisite for the study, where we ourselves admitted that there will be impacted on the environments and protecting the environments, all that stuff. I see how the EIA comes into it, and the question is, so what do you do now? Because for us, of course, we don't have these regional scale models that would evaluate the environment before and after. EIA is the only solution. But I would say that the best way to handle that now is to consider EIA as a project requirement on day one. Than EIA once the project is over, you give an EIA. There's so much of pressure to speed up the project, and that's wrong in our system to go and ask somebody to change the project. So I would say some of these EIA requirements into the project on day one. See project design at the design stage, you are able to these features and take EIA as a requirement on the first day, rather than giving it as an afterthought. I think there is something you can do rather than just staying with the way you have. Actually, that's for Mr. Kirthiratna. So I hope it helps. The floating solar reservoirs, I've seen it in US too. I don't know directly what it would do as harm, but I know one idea is that it will reduce the dissolved oxygen and this and that. But I would say there's a nice research project somebody could pick up and understand how much of reduction in the sunlight can a reservoir afford without losing its fish population, for example. So and what is not good is to do something without totally considering the environment. So of course there are consequences, and all we do is as engineers, we are not biased one way or the other. We're not for solar power, we are not for environment. We just try to make the best for all the people. So I would say, carry out a study to make sure that the amount of the environmental support is still there after the solar power, and not to just make judgments before any information is available. So so it's about associations and can suggest natural plants for removing heavy metals, absorbing heavy metals nearby. I would, you have to understand that we engineers know so much, and that's about it. There are things that we have to ask other people, and one group of people we consult is the other people who do the vegetation. Like, for example, removal of heavy metals is something that the vegetation is really good at, and that's not exactly an engineer's knowledge piece. So I would say open-minded and ask it. There's no harm in asking people to support it. And there are so many people in these agencies who are really good at understanding the behavior of this plant. So I think these projects need so many from so many other disciplines. We only know the hydraulics part and the hydrology part and some of the engineering components, and that is limited. And if you look at the teams that work in mostly US, some of these teams are overwhelmed with scientists and vegetation people, and that's something that you need to have. Right. I think, Engineer Suri Bandar is saying Southern Parakram Bhav is guiding our institutions to create water projects. I think what is important is that when you are doing these sessions, think about the functionality and the functionality of the ecosystem also, and not just purely as a detention pond just for the flood. So it should survive for the dry season. The fish should live. The plant should be there to clean it up and make sure that when the storms come in, it gets in the runoff and it'll remove the pollution. So do it as a design. I mean, as an engineer, my advice is like all these things can be designed rather than just put it on the ground. So I think there's so much room to grow. There are so much things to improve. So Sali is there actually, one of my friends. I believe you are suggesting an integrated and multidisciplinary approach under the umbrella of a single organization essential for sustainable development and management of our natural resources. Wasn't Mahavirali Authority such an organization? Actually, yes, but in 1978, it was. At present, Sri Lanka, it seems to be moving opposite direction. You know this stuff. You actually work here. Here's the interesting part. I think Mahavirali was in 1978 the best you could do at that time. I think what did not happen was that we never learned to evolve with that system to serve the people. It became a democratic institution as opposed to a agency primarily driven by the needs of the people, and we never adopted the new ideas. And also the fund is exactly perfect. We have to get money from agencies, and the donor agencies are based on making sure that their investments are protected, and so have bounds, and we cannot go outside of those bounds. So as a result of that, not being able to stand on our own feet created this setup where we just follow some guiding donor agency telling us what to do. So that resulted in this. And I agree that as an idea, Mahavirali was supposed to be this organization. But when you compare with the TVA had this thing called the corporate groups, where groups of farmers came together, and then they have much more in those projects. A lot of the science and the engineering people, and they adopted some of the farming practices on the ground with scientists, and that became a success. TVA, Tennessee is not an area where people wanted to go and settle. Just like going to an area in the Anuradhapura district, it was a very harsh. I would say, I don't want to say harsh, but it's not exactly an area where everybody go run and rush. But still, people managed to get enough resources to create a system that would sustain. I think we need to do that too, and I think it has not happened. I mean, you can see from the Mahavirali report that they are not exactly happy with the environmental sustainability of these project areas. So, any
yeah, Dr. Santalal. Actually, I think if there's no any question, we can wind up. And before wind up, I would like to invite you to give some kind of message, maybe what as a ISL, what we can do, or what country as a professional we can do, what we can do. Then after that, Engineer Chaminda Jayasinghe will be given a vote of thanks.
Okay. What I'm suggesting is that the IESL try to be very focused on the engineering aspect of these things. So not to be partisan, not to be like pro consulting or pro government or pro industry or anything. Just look at the population itself and the environment it lives in, and create a set of rules that would be regardless of the party or the organization, that we all can agree. And one of these ideas is to, for example, preserve the water resources for the future generation. That's an idea that no one can say no. And the other idea is that to preserve the environment along with it, so that the water itself is preserved when it's available. So that's an idea that nobody can protest, because it was very clear through these historic studies that if you don't have the environment, you don't have any useful water to in the system. So protecting these resources is for the future. Even though you may find the counter arguments of, yeah, you cannot develop. Yeah, sure. Look at the past. You need to develop too, but you need to develop along with the protections for your own survival. I would say that there is a strong message that the IESL can create as a common platform, and making sure everybody agrees is important. So once you have that common agreement among the IESL members that you need these prime resources to be preserved under any project, I would say that the government would have no other choice but to use that as a guideline when it's taking its own steps. Now, the way it is now, I don't think there is any standing guideline. There is no standing guideline, so I don't believe that the government itself is capable of taking the initiative. So I'm saying you don't have to wait for anybody else. You can actually start this off in a nice way and then look for the core ideas. I think you can learn so much from the Clean Water Act if you read some of that stuff. And you have the internet to read it, and create your own set of rules for projects in Sri Lanka. I think that would be a very useful thing. So in the future, when people argue, at least they have a basis, and they have a very impartial basis. It would not be political. It would not be, so nobody can say that came from this government. It doesn't come from the government. It comes from the people and the representatives of the people. Actually, if you look at IESL, we have people from all walks of life, people from all over Sri Lanka. So nobody can say that IESL is actually partisan. We are smarter than the average, but other than that, I don't think there is any bias. So for the IESL to take an initiative to create that I think it's a good idea, and I think it would fly. And I don't think anybody can, with a good reason, go against it. I would say start off in it, and in the meantime, be open-minded. So the peer review is the second idea. So I only have two ideas. Don't be close-minded in a way that you are worried that somebody's going to tell something bad about your project. I would say, you can keep it, I'm not saying it doesn't have to be all open to public, but some of these conversations about projects through people in different disciplines is not a bad thing. And as long as you remain civil and you respect each other, I think people should be sharing their ideas with other people and do reviews of these projects and take out, the idea that this is my project and his project. There's no such project. After 20, 30 years, we all retire, and then somebody else takes over. So none of these things are for anybody's personal benefits. It's for the future of the country. So I would say, come together on that basis and create these ideas. I hope it would go well.
Okay, Engineer Chaminda Jayasinghe.
Okay.
Our deputy chairman of Civil Engineers Technology, they will do the vote of thanks.
Right. Thank you, Engineer Lalit. Now we have come to the end of this session. Thank you very much, Dr. Vasantalal, dedicating your valuable time and conducting very useful and informative session and sharing lessons learned from projects in USA and comparing Sri Lanka context. Thank you very much, sir. Again, Doctor, you took us different areas of Sri Lanka, the ancient memories to present context. You mentioned importance of the national water policy and the extensive models of flood model and other latest technology. I think those kind of things very important for our Sri Lanka engineers. And also thank you very much for your suggestions for our future development of water sector. On this regard, in addition to, I want to thank the Engineer Lalit Pallegama, Chairman Civil Engineering Section Committee, and the Engineer Sanjeeva Vijayasinghe, who is in CECB. They give their full support and organize this valuable session. Especially after, I want to thank our online audience. Today we have 190 members join today's session. I have seen many senior engineers in the water sector lectures, and many senior members join today's session and actively participate today event and ask many questions and giving the question in chat box. Also, then I want to thank for success of this event in staff of IESL, especially IT section, who given the Zoom facility and all the other arrangement. Finally, I want to thank, this is another one of the successful session conducted by Seminars and Publication Section Subcommittee under Civil Engineering Section Committee. On this regard, we will wind up today's session and concluded the session. Thank you to join all of us, and stay safe and good night. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.